4 days after Pearl Harbor, Adolf Hitler made the single worst decision of his entire life. And here's the thing. He made it with absolute confidence. He made it with a smile on his face. He had no idea he had just sealed Germany's fate. Picture this. December 11th, 1941. The Kroll Opera House in Berlin, where the Reichstag had been meeting since the original building burned down years earlier. Adolf Hitler approaches the podium, shoulders back, chin raised, radiating the kind of supreme self-assurance that had carried him from a failed artist in Vienna to the most powerful dictator in Europe. The chamber is packed with Nazi deputies. Cameras are rolling. The world is watching. And for the next 90 minutes, Hitler delivers a speech that will ultimately doom everything he has built. He declares war on the United States of America. Now you might be thinking, wait, didn't Japan attack Pearl Harbor? Didn't Japan start the war with America? Why would Hitler voluntarily jump into that fight? Great question. And the answer reveals something crucial about how Hitler's mind worked. Something that would cost Germany everything. During that speech, Hitler unleashed everything he had against America. He mocked President Franklin Roosevelt as a warmonger, a puppet controlled by Jewish financiers, a failed leader who had wrecked the American economy and now needed a war to cover up his domestic failures. He dismissed American military power as laughable. He pointed out that just 2 years before, the United States Army ranked 18th in the world by size. 18th, smaller than Portugal, barely bigger than Romania. The deputies roared their approval. Hitler's voice rose to that familiar theatrical crescendo. He declared that Germany and its Axis partners would crush this mongrel nation, this decadent democracy, this racial hodgepodge of immigrants and inferior peoples. Here is what you need to understand. This was not just propaganda. This was not Hitler saying what he thought would play well with his audience. He genuinely believed every word. His contempt for America ran so deep, was so thoroughly woven into his worldview that he could not see what he had just done. He had awakened a sleeping giant, and he had no idea the giant even existed. So how did the most cunning political mind in Europe make such a catastrophic miscalculation? How did a man who had outmaneuvered every opponent, who had conquered most of continental Europe, who had built a war machine that terrified the world, completely misjudge an entire nation? The answer lies in Hitler's ideology, and it is a fascinating case study in how beliefs can blind you to reality. Hitler's understanding of America was filtered entirely through his racial theories. He looked at the United States and saw a country he believed was fundamentally broken. Why? Because it was diverse, because it was democratic, because it allowed what he considered inferior races to mix with superior ones. In Hitler's twisted logic, this made America inherently weak. A nation of mongrels could never match a racially pure nation like Germany. Democracy was a disease that sapped national will. Capitalism created soft, materialistic people incapable of true sacrifice. He had said these things countless times in private conversations. He genuinely believed that American society was decadent, that its people were soft, that its racial mixture was a fatal weakness rather than any kind of strength. And here is the critical mistake. Hitler knew in abstract terms that America had industrial capacity. He had heard about Henry Ford's assembly lines. He understood that America produced automobiles in staggering numbers. But he interpreted this information through his ideological lens. Mass production of consumer goods, that was not military strength. Making cars for housewives was not the same as forging an army. Besides, America was far away, protected by 2 vast oceans, historically isolationist. Hitler had spent 2 years watching Britain struggle just to defend its own island from the Luftwaffe. The idea that America could somehow build, transport, and sustain a military force capable of actually invading continental Europe, it seemed absurd. He could not have been more wrong. When news of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor reached Hitler at the Wolf's Lair, his military headquarters deep in the forests of East Prussia, his initial reaction was surprise. Then, quickly, satisfaction. Japan had struck first. Technically, under the Tripartite Pact, Germany was not even obligated to join the war. Hitler could have stayed out of it, but he saw opportunity. For over a year, American ships had been supplying Britain with weapons, food, and materiel that kept the British war effort alive. Hitler wanted to unleash his submarine fleet against this shipping without restriction. Pearl Harbor gave him his excuse. 4 days later, he made it official. And in doing so, he ensured that the full weight of American industrial power would now be directed at destroying his Reich. The first warning signs appeared in early 1942. German naval intelligence started reporting something strange. American shipyards were launching cargo vessels at rates that seemed impossible. The Americans had developed something called Liberty ships. These were cargo vessels built from prefabricated sections, welded together instead of riveted. The reports claimed these ships were being completed in weeks rather than months. Some were supposedly being finished in under 2 weeks. Hitler dismissed it. The figures had to be exaggerated. American propaganda designed to intimidate the Axis. Even if partially true, it did not matter. His U-boat fleet was sinking Allied shipping faster than it could possibly be replaced. The Battle of the Atlantic was being won. Then came the aircraft production numbers. And this is where the story gets truly remarkable. In May of 1942, German intelligence provided Hitler with estimates of American aircraft production. The Americans were claiming they would produce 60,000 aircraft that year. 60,000. Stop and think about that number for a moment. Germany, with its entire economy mobilized for war, with years of preparation and expansion behind it, was producing perhaps 15,000 aircraft annually. And the Americans were claiming they would quadruple that? Hitler's reaction was recorded by multiple witnesses. He called it Jewish fantasy. Propaganda meant to demoralize the German people. Pure nonsense. Albert Speer, his brilliant young minister of armaments, tried to explain. American automotive factories were being converted to aircraft production. The same assembly line techniques that built Fords and Chevrolets could build bombers and fighters. The skills transferred. The industrial logic was identical. Hitler waved this away. Making automobiles and making warplanes were completely different endeavors. The precision required the complexity, the need for highly skilled labor. These things could not be mass-produced like washing machines. It was simply not possible. He was wrong. Catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. By late 1942, American forces had landed in North Africa. Operation Torch put American boots on the ground in the European theater for the first time. And while the initial American performance was unimpressive, while green troops stumbled and experienced German units punished them badly at places like Kasserine Pass, something else caught the attention of German commanders. Something worrying. American units seemed to have unlimited supplies. They expended ammunition freely. When vehicles were destroyed, new ones appeared almost immediately. This was not how armies normally operated. Even the Wehrmacht, famous for its efficiency, had to carefully manage resources. Shells had to be counted. Fuel had to be rationed. Replacement vehicles took time to arrive. The Americans fought like they had infinite reserves, because as it turned out they did. The intelligence reports kept flowing into Berlin, and the numbers kept climbing. American tank production for 1942, 25,000 vehicles. German production, 9,000. American truck production, 500,000. German production, 70,000. Do you grasp what those numbers mean? For every tank Germany built, America built nearly 3. For every truck rolling off a German assembly line, 7 American trucks were heading to ports for shipment overseas. Hitler's response was to question the intelligence. Surely these figures were exaggerated. Surely American production quality was poor. Their tanks must be inferior, their trucks unreliable. But his generals were starting to understand something Hitler refused to accept. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, wrote in his diary after fighting American forces in North Africa. He described watching American artillery bombardments that expended more shells in a single barrage than German forces might have available for an entire offensive. He noted that American units, when pushed back, simply reformed with fresh equipment and attacked again, and again, and again. There was no winning a war of attrition against such an enemy. They could afford losses. Germany could not. The real turning point came in 1943, though Hitler would never fully acknowledge it. Albert Speer later recounted a meeting where he presented Hitler with updated intelligence on American production capacity. The numbers for 1943 were even more staggering than the year before. American aircraft production had hit 85,000 planes. Tank production was approaching 30,000. The Americans were now outproducing all Axis powers combined in virtually every category of military equipment. Speer watched Hitler's face as he absorbed these figures. There was a long, uncomfortable silence. The Führer, for once, seemed at a loss for words. Then Hitler said something Speer remembered for the rest of his life. The Americans can produce as many tanks as they want. But can they produce the men to crew them? It was a revealing moment. Hitler was no longer denying the production figures. He could not. The evidence was overwhelming. But he was grasping desperately for some reason, any reason, to believe that America could not truly threaten the Reich. Perhaps they could build the machines, but surely they lacked the martial spirit, the discipline, the willingness to sacrifice, the warrior soul that warfare demanded. This belief would also prove completely wrong. By mid-1943, American forces were landing in Sicily. The industrial capacity was translating into deployed military power. The United States had expanded from 174,000 active-duty military personnel in 1939 to over 9 million by 1943. They had gone from virtually no modern armored divisions to fielding 16 of them. Their air forces were growing so fast that German intelligence could barely track the new units being formed. And here is the part that should have terrified Hitler. They were doing all of this while simultaneously fighting Japan across the vast Pacific Ocean. Two major wars, two hemispheres, and America was winning both. Something in Hitler's rhetoric began to shift. He stopped mocking American military capability quite so openly. In speeches, he started acknowledging America's material superiority while insisting that German fighting spirit would overcome mere numbers. It was a significant change, an implicit admission that he had been wrong. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, recorded a private conversation with Hitler in May of 1943. Hitler had been reviewing reports from the Battle of the Atlantic. Despite deploying more submarines than ever before, the U-boat fleet was now losing the tonnage war. American and British shipyards were launching new ships faster than U-boats could sink them. In April alone, Allied shipyards had launched 140 new vessels totaling over 800,000 tons of shipping. The U-boats had managed to sink just 39 ships. The mathematics were brutal, undeniable, and Hitler, according to Goebbels, was uncharacteristically quiet after reviewing these figures. Then he said something remarkable, something Goebbels felt was worth recording. We have underestimated the Americans. It was as close as Hitler would ever come to admitting that declaring war on America might have been a fundamental strategic error. But the evidence kept mounting. In November of 1943, American bombers began appearing over Germany in formations that seemed to darken the sky. The 8th Air Force was launching raids with 300, 400, sometimes 500 heavy bombers at a time. Each B-17 Flying Fortress represented tens of thousands of man-hours of manufacturing, sophisticated equipment, highly trained crews. The Americans were throwing them into battle in numbers that suggested they viewed them as expendable, because to American industry they were expendable. When a B-17 was shot down, another one rolled off a production line in Seattle or Wichita to replace it. When a crew was lost, the massive American training program produced replacements. The pipeline never stopped. Meanwhile, in a factory in Michigan, a young woman named Rose Monroe was working the night shift at the Ford bomber plant in Willow Run. She had never seen combat. She never would. But every B-24 Liberator that rolled off her assembly line carried her fingerprints straight to Berlin. She was one of millions, ordinary Americans who had become, without fully realizing it, the most devastating weapon in the Allied arsenal. The Luftwaffe was fighting a war of attrition it could not win. Every German fighter pilot killed was essentially irreplaceable. Years of training gone in an instant. Every American pilot lost was a tragedy, but strategically manageable. The training schools kept producing more. Hitler's strategic decisions in 1944 revealed his growing, if incomplete, understanding of what he was facing. He became obsessed with wonder weapons, V-2 rockets, jet fighters. Technologies that might somehow offset American numerical superiority. He poured increasingly scarce resources into these programs with growing desperation. The logic was clear, even if flawed. If Germany could not match American production, it needed technological breakthroughs that would make production numbers irrelevant. One jet fighter might be worth 10 conventional aircraft. One V-2 rocket might terrorize Britain into surrender where conventional bombing had failed. It did not work. The wonder weapons came too late in too few numbers to change anything. And then came Normandy. When the Allies landed on June 6, 1944, the scale of American military power became undeniable even to Hitler. The invasion fleet included over 5,000 ships. Air support involved more than 11,000 aircraft. The logistics were almost incomprehensible. Millions of tons of supplies, hundreds of thousands of vehicles. Fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, spare parts. All of it transported across the Atlantic Ocean, staged in Britain, and then hurled onto the beaches of France. And this was just one theater. Simultaneously, the Americans were conducting massive operations in the Pacific, island-hopping toward Japan with fleets and air forces that dwarfed what they had deployed in Europe. Speer later wrote about Hitler's reaction to reports from Normandy. The Führer had expected his Atlantic wall to hold. He had convinced himself that the Allies could not sustain a major amphibious invasion across the English Channel. When the beachheads held, when they expanded, when American forces began breaking out into France, Hitler's response was to blame his generals, to scream about betrayal, to insist that if his orders had been followed, the invasion would have been thrown back into the sea. But in quieter moments, Speer observed something else. A kind of stunned recognition that Germany was fighting an enemy that could not be exhausted, could not be bled dry, could not be defeated through attrition. One moment seemed to crystallize this realization. In August of 1944, intelligence reported that American factories had produced over 96,000 aircraft in the previous 12 months. 96,000. In the same period, Germany had produced just under 40,000. The Americans were outproducing Germany by more than 2-to-1 in the air while simultaneously outproducing them in tanks, trucks, ships, artillery, and virtually everything else. And American production was still accelerating. Hitler, according to multiple witnesses, asked how this was possible. Germany had mobilized its entire economy. Women were working in factories. Slave labor from conquered territories supplemented the workforce. Every resource was directed toward war production. How could the Americans, fighting on two fronts, separated from both wars by vast oceans, possibly be outproducing the Reich? The answer was devastating in its simplicity. America's industrial base was larger, more advanced, more efficient, and completely untouched by war. German factories operated under constant threat of Allied bombing. American factories ran 3 shifts a day in perfect safety, thousands of miles from any enemy. German industry struggled with resource shortages, transportation bottlenecks, and damaged infrastructure. American industry had abundant resources, intact railways and river systems perfect for moving heavy materials. But there was something deeper, something Hitler's ideology prevented him from grasping. The American system had mobilized voluntarily. Workers were not slaves. They were not coerced laborers forced to produce at gunpoint. They were citizens who believed in what they were doing. They worked overtime willingly. They competed to exceed production quotas. The same democracy Hitler had mocked as weakness had proven remarkably effective at organizing and motivating industrial output. By late 1944, Hitler rarely mentioned America in his military conferences. When he did, it was usually to complain about American material superiority while insisting that individual German soldiers were still superior. One German was worth 5 Americans. Fighting spirit would ultimately prevail. But the mathematics of industrial warfare do not care about fighting spirit. The final phase of Hitler's education came in early 1945 as American armies crossed the Rhine River and drove into Germany itself. The soldiers who entered German territory were not the soft, racially inferior weaklings Hitler had imagined. They were well-fed, well-equipped, confident troops backed by overwhelming firepower and logistical support that seemed almost miraculous. German commanders reported something that must have been particularly difficult for Hitler to hear. American units fought cautiously. They used their material superiority to minimize casualties rather than prove their courage. They called in massive artillery bombardments rather than risk infantry assaults. They waited for air support rather than attack immediately. They fought like men who knew their lives had value, like men who had the luxury of patience, because they did have that luxury. America could afford to be patient. Germany could not. Speer recounted one of his final conversations with Hitler in April of 1945. Soviet forces were closing in on Berlin from the east. American forces were approaching from the west. Hitler was reviewing reports of American units crossing the Elbe River. The Americans had bridged the river in a matter of hours using prefabricated equipment. They had established supply lines with remarkable efficiency. They had pushed forward with what seemed like unlimited fuel and ammunition. And Hitler said, almost to himself, something that Speer never forgot. They have made war into an industrial process. It was perhaps the most insightful observation Hitler ever made about his American enemy. The United States had indeed industrialized warfare to an unprecedented degree. They had applied assembly line thinking not just to manufacturing weapons, but to the entire war effort. Training was standardized. Logistics were systematized. Tactics were refined through careful analysis and continuous improvement. Everything optimized like a factory perfecting its production methods. This was America's true strength. And Hitler's ideology had prevented him from recognizing it until far too late. He had believed that war was fundamentally about will, about racial superiority, about the martial spirit of a people. He had convinced himself that Germany's supposed racial advantages and military tradition would overcome mere material factors. But modern industrial warfare was not about individual courage or tactical brilliance, though those things mattered. It was about production capacity. Logistical systems, resource management, the ability to replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. It was about sustainability over years of grinding conflict, about depth of reserves and breadth of industrial base. America had all of these things. Germany did not. The final statistics tell the story Hitler never wanted to hear. From 1941 to 1945, the United States produced roughly 300,000 aircraft, over 88,000 tanks, more than 2 million trucks, nearly 6,000 naval vessels. They supplied not just their own forces but equipped Allied armies through the Lend-Lease program. They sent the Soviet Union over 400,000 trucks, 13,000 tanks, and 14,000 aircraft. They supplied Britain with everything from ammunition to food. They did this while maintaining civilian production at levels that kept American citizens better fed and housed than citizens of any other warring nation. Germany, by contrast, produced approximately 120,000 aircraft and 46,000 tanks across the entire war. The disparity was not close. It was overwhelming. Hitler spent his final days in the Führer bunker beneath Berlin, issuing orders to armies that no longer existed, moving phantom divisions on maps, insisting that wonder weapons would still somehow turn the tide. He never publicly acknowledged the full magnitude of his miscalculation about America. To do so would have required admitting that his entire ideological framework was wrong. That democracy was not inherently weak. That racial diversity was not a fatal flaw. That industrial capitalism could outproduce his planned war economy. But in private moments, witnessed by those around him, the realization had clearly taken hold. Speer described Hitler in those final weeks as occasionally falling into long silences when American military operations were discussed, as if contemplating the magnitude of what he had gotten wrong. One of Hitler's secretaries, Traudl Jung, later recalled him saying in late April, just days before he took his own life, that the Americans had proven more formidable than anticipated. It was a massive understatement. The Americans had not just proven more formidable. They had demonstrated a capacity for industrial warfare that exceeded even the most optimistic Allied predictions from 1941. They had built a military machine from almost nothing in less than 4 years. They had projected power across 2 oceans simultaneously. They had sustained years of intensive combat while continuously improving their equipment and tactics. They had done everything Hitler believed impossible. The tragedy, from a German perspective, was that this realization came far too late to matter. By the time Hitler understood what American entry into the war truly meant, Germany's fate was already sealed. The declaration of war in December 1940, one had set in motion forces that no amount of German fighting spirit or tactical brilliance could overcome. Hitler had gambled that America was weak, decadent, incapable of military greatness. He had bet Germany's future on this assessment. He lost. The final irony is that Hitler's own beliefs prevented him from understanding his enemy until nothing could be done about it. His racial theories told him that a diverse democracy could never compete with a racially pure dictatorship. His contempt for capitalism blinded him to its productive efficiency. His faith in the superiority of German military tradition made him underestimate a nation that could learn, adapt, and improve with breathtaking speed. America did not win World War II alone. The Soviet Union bore the brunt of German military power and suffered losses beyond imagination. Britain stood alone for over a year and provided the staging ground for the liberation of Europe. Resistance movements across occupied territories tied down German forces and provided crucial intelligence. But America's industrial might made Allied victory possible. It provided the tanks, planes, ships, and supplies that enabled offensive operations everywhere. It replaced losses faster than the Axis could inflict them. It sustained years of combat across multiple theaters simultaneously. And Hitler never truly understood this until Germany was already defeated. His realization, when it came, was too late, too incomplete, and ultimately too painful to fully acknowledge. In the end, Hitler had declared war on a nation whose true strength he could not comprehend. He fought a type of war he did not understand against an enemy whose greatest weapon was not courage or tactics, but the unglamorous, relentless power of industrial production. The factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh, the shipyards of California and Virginia, the aircraft plants scattered across the American heartland. These were the real weapons that defeated the Third Reich. Hitler understood this eventually. But by then, American soldiers were already in Germany, and the war he had started with such confidence in December 1940, one was ending in the smoking ruins of his capital. The Führer who had mocked American weakness spent his final hours hiding underground from American bombs. Defeated by the very nation he had dismissed as incapable of military greatness, he had asked whether America could sustain a long war. The answer, delivered in millions of tons of steel and explosives, was yes, America could fight as long as necessary. Their industrial capacity made them effectively inexhaustible. They could replace every loss, sustain every offensive, continue fighting until total victory was achieved. In those final days in the bunker, as American and Soviet artillery grew louder each hour, Hitler finally understood. The nation he had declared war on with such contempt had proven capable of something he never imagined, waging industrial warfare on a scale that made Germany's vaunted military machine look almost primitive by comparison. That was the ultimate lesson of Hitler's war with America. Not that American soldiers were better, though many were excellent. Not that American tactics were superior, though they often proved effective, but that America had built a system capable of producing war materials in quantities that made victory mathematically inevitable, no matter how long the fighting lasted. Hitler had asked the wrong question all along. It was never about whether America could fight forever. It was about whether Germany could survive long enough to make the question matter. The answer, written in the rubble of Berlin, was no.